As we all know, Formula One, also known as F1, is the highest class of international racing for open-wheel single-seater Formula racing cars sanctioned by the FIA. The World Drivers' Championship, which became the FIA Formula One World Championship in 1981, has been one of the premier forms of racing around the world since its inaugural season in 1950. The word formula in the name refers to the set of rules to which all participants' cars must conform. A Formula One season consists of a series of races known as Grand Prix, which take place worldwide on both purpose-built circuits and closed public roads. Formula One is a global leviathan. In 2017, its global audience was 352.3 million people. The sponsorship income of the manufacturers is in the hundreds of millions of euros per year. The top speed of Formula One car is 231 miles per hour. Put simply, everything in Formula One is done on a huge scale. One of Formula One's greatest strengths is the fact that despite all of the engineering expertise and technology, it is a simple sport. A point system is used at Grand Prix to determine two annual world championships, one for drivers, the other for constructors. Each driver must hold a valid super license, the highest class of racing license issued by the FIA. The races must run on tracks graded 1, formerly A, the highest grade rating FIA. There is something inherently visceral about watching incredibly skilled drivers hurdle hugely quick cars around a racetrack. Formula One is a safer sport now than ever in its history. Indeed, throughout its nearly 80 years past, Formula One has every year become both faster and safer. This is the real engineering skill of the sport. Formula One cars are the fastest regulated road course racing cars in the world, owing to very high cornering speeds achieved through the generation of large amounts of aerodynamic downforce. Much of this downforce is generated by front and rear wings, which have the side effect of causing severe turbulence behind each car. The turbulence reduces the downforce generated by a car falling directly behind, making it hard to overtake. Major changes to the cars for the 2022 season has seen greater use of ground effect aerodynamics and modified wings to reduce the turbulence behind the cars with the goal of making overtaking easier. The cars are dependent on electronics and aerodynamics, suspension and tires, traction control, launch control and automatic shifting, plus other electronic driving aids were first banned in 1994. They were briefly reintroduced in 2001 and have more recently been banned since 2004 and 2008 respectively. Now we will be talking more about F1's origin and history. Stay tuned to find out more. Also like and subscribe to our channel. First up, origins. Ever since there has been cars, there have been car races. As technology improved and cars became more numerous, European manufacturers as early as 1894 in France began racing as a way of competing and marketing their product. In the interwar years, a series of Grand Prix race days throughout Europe designed to show off car and driver skills to a receptive European population. Had World War II not intervened, it is likely that Formula One would have begun much earlier. Certainly in the interwar years, there was an increasing move towards codifying the sports from the ragtag one of events. With the rise of Nazism and the focus of French and Belgian and other European engineers on preparing for war, however, Formula One was put on hold until 1946. The name Formula One refers to a standardized set of rules with which drivers and engineers must comply. In 1946, the idea of a Formula One championship began. From 1946 to 1950, the races were not part of an overall calendar and races tended to be ad hoc affairs. However, there was a growing desire to create a single competition based on performance across a wide range of races. Ultimately, the goal was to determine who was the best driver and who was the best manufacturer. The final details on the Drivers' World Championship were not agreed upon until 1950, and the first World Championship Grand Prix took place in 1950 at Silverstone in the UK. Even then, only 7 of the total Grand Prix counted towards the World Championship, although the fundamental structures were in place. Even as the championship grew, there remained non-championship races until 1983. The modern era of Formula One began in 1950, but the roots of Grand Prix racing are far earlier, tracing to the pioneer road races in France in the 1890s. Through the Edwardian years, the bleak 20s, the German domination of the 1930s, and the early post-war years of the Italian supremacy. At the birth of motor racing, cars were upright and heavy, roads were tarred sand or wood, reliability was problematic, drivers were accompanied by mechanics, and races, usually on public roads from town to town, were impossibly long by modern standards. Regarded as the first motor race proper was a 1200-kilometer road race from Paris to Bordeaux, and back in 1895 won by Émile Levasseur with his Panhard et Levasseur in 48 hours. One of the most successful drivers of the early year was Fernand Charron, who won the Paris-Bordeaux race in 1899, also in a Panhard, at the blazing average speed of 29.9 miles per hour. The first race using the appellation Grand Prix was 1901's French Grand Prix at Le Mans, won by Ferrand Gilles with a Renault, who covered 700 miles at 63 miles per hour. The 1906 Grand Prix des Automobiles Club de France, commonly known as the 1906 French Grand Prix, was originated at the prompting of the French automobile industry as an alternative to the Gordon Bennett races, which limited each competing country's number of entries regardless of the size of its industry. In 1908, the Targa Florio in Sicily saw the appearance of pits, shallow emplacement dug by the side of the track where mechanics could labor with the detachable rims on early GP tires, themselves a major technical improvement over the earlier technique of permanently attached wheels and spokes. But even so, racing cars of the earlier years were too heavy and fast for their tires. Christian Lotte-Klanger's winning Mercedes shredded 10 tires in the 1908 French Grand Prix at Dieppe. In 1914, the massive 4 1.2-liter Mercedes of Daimler-Benz dominated the French Grand Prix at Lens, 20 laps of a 23.3-mile circuit, taking the 3 places and introducing control of drivers by a signal from the pits. During World War I, racing was halted in Europe and many drivers participated in the US Indianapolis 500. Enzo Ferrari, whose real fame was to follow as a team manager and manufacturer with Scuderia Ferrari, formed in 1929 to race Alfa Romeo P2s, finished second in 1920 Voiture race at Le Mans, the first international road race in France in 6 years. By tradition, the Italian racing driver in action is an excitable character given to shouting, gesticulating, waving his fist, baring his teeth, and giving away to his emotions. Fangio Nuvolari filled this role splendidly. The first and until Dan Gurney's Eagle Westlake at Spa-Francorchamps in 1967, the only Grand Prix victory by an American-built car was by Jimmy Murphy in the 1921 French Grand Prix at Le Mans, driving a Duesenberg. Among the best of the 1920s manufacturers were Bugatti. Those straight-edge Type 35Bs won the French and Spanish GPs in 1929 and the Monaco, French and Belgian GPs in 1930, and Fiat, which introduced the supercharger for the first time in 1923. The year 1931 saw the formation of the International Grand Prix, later known as European Automobile Championship, since all of the Grandes Épreuves took place in Europe. It was the first international drivers' championship in motor racing history. The original regulations stipulated 10 hours races in France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain, with 2 drivers for each car due to the duration of the races. All cars without restriction on weight or engine capacity, hence known as Formula Libre, could participate. The winners would be driving pairing who in the 10-hour period covered the longest distance. The Great Depression of the early 1930s led to an unfortunate lack of money for and general interest in the Grand Prix racing, which saw the emergence of the legendary Tazio Nuvolari, which wins in the Alfa Romeo P3 Monza, in the Mille Miglia at Monaco, and the Italian GP at Monza were stunning. His fabled victories well into Nuvolari's 40s in the 1933 Monaco GP, the first in which starting grid position were determined by qualifying performance, and which saw 9 Monza Alphas 8Cs, 7 Bugattis Type 51s, and 3 Maseratis 8CMs entered. And in the 1938 Donington Grand Prix were epic. No one of the spectators at the latter, who went home having seen a tremendous race, could have imagined that it would take 55 years before the next Donington GP was run. As winner, Nuvolari got a worthy successor, Ayrton Senna, known to Italian fans as the Flying Mountain or the Great Little Man. Nuvolari was just 5 foot 3 inches, or 160 cm tall, and he soon found out that he didn't have the muscular strength to force the cars around the corners with the steering wheel. So instead, he developed a technique where he put his car into a four-wheeler drift and then controlled the slide with the throttle. In all, Nuvolari spent 30 years in motor racing and, as was his wish, was buried in his uniform when he died after a long illness, a short few years after the modern F1 series was initiated. But in 1934, the balance of power in racing would begin to shift from Italy to Germany, with the emergence of factory teams from Auto Union, now Audi, and Mercedes-Benz, behind massive financial support from the Third Reich government on orders from Adolf Hitler. These powerful and beautiful German machines introduced aerodynamics into Grand Prix car design and ran on exotic secret fuel brews. Driving the slick silver 3-liter V12 Auto Union in his trademark canary yellow jersey, Nuvolari achieved new greatness with these incredible well-engineered automobiles. But nothing to top his 1935 German GP victory on the original 14.173 milli Nordschleife Northern Loop at the Nürburgring, where he defeated 9 modern German cars in a 4-year-old Alfa Romeo. For the race, Mercedes-Benz had entered no fewer than 5 cars driven by Caracciola, von Brauchitsch, Fagioli, Gier, and Lang. The V16 4.9-liter 350 bhp Auto Unions were piloted by Stock, Rosmere, Pitts, and Vergy. Both German cars could and did exceed 175 miles per hour. Nuvolari passed Rosmere on lap 6, passed von Brauchitsch on lap 7, was repassed by the latter on lap 8, caught von Brauchitsch again, and Fagioli as well on lap 9, and passed Caracciola to lead the race on lap 10. The 250,000 German spectators could scarcely believe their eyes. Nuvolari then had to sit through a typical Italian stop of over 2 minutes before he got back onto the track. Angry at the delay, his blood was up and he drove like a total maniac. Over the next 5 laps, he passed Caracciola, Stock, and Fagioli as if they were nothing more than club racers. A later than usual pit stop by Rosmere moved the little Italian back into second place once more. At the carousel curve, a banked tight left-hand hairpin paved on the inside line with concrete, now renamed Caracciola Carousel. On the final lap, little more than 200 yards separated the red car from Mercedes of von Brauchitsch, Nuvolari trailing, when a puncture on the silver car propelled Taggio to an astonishing victory. Von Brauchitsch continued on the rim only to have to see the Alfa Romeo pass and go on to win in front of the astounded spectators. With half a kilometer to go, a second tire blew on the Mercedes and a crying von Brauchitsch had to see 3 more cars pass before he could get his car over the line. For a second there was silence, but then the Italian was met by tremendous cheers from the crowd. This was once and for all triumph for the human qualities of skill, courage, and judgment against the hard mechanical facts of speed, power, and acceleration. The Nazi officials were confounded by the lack of a recording of the Italian anthem to play over the loudspeakers. Only the Deutschland over alles had been ready for the inevitable German triumph, but Nuvolari himself was able to right the situation with his own record of the Marcia Real, which he carried as a good luck charm. The early days. Motor racing around World War II initiated a new formula, originally called Formula A, but soon to be known as Formula 1, for cars of 1500cc supercharged and 4500cc supercharged. The minimum race distance was reduced from 500 km 311 miles to 300 km 186 miles, allowing the Monaco Grand Prix to be reintroduced after a 2-year interval in 1950. The FIA, Federation International des Automobiles, announced plans for a world championship at a meeting held that year. On 10th April 1950, Juan Manuel Fangio in a Maserati won the Pau Grand Prix, first contest to be labeled an international Formula 1 race. A month later, Silverstone hosted the British Grand Prix, the first sanctioned championship race for Formula 1 Grand Prix cars, and the Formula 1 World Championship was born. Only 7 of the 20 or so though Formula 1 races that season counted towards the driver's title, but the championship was up and running. Even as more races were introduced in the World Championship, there were plenty of non-championship Formula 1 races as well. Like Britain's International Trophy race, non-championship GP races continued until 1983 when rising costs ruled them unprofitable. Winner at Silverstone 1950, adding pole position and fast lap in the process, and the first F1 champion, Giuseppe Nino Farina drove an Alfa Romeo 158, capturing the Belgium, Swiss and Italian races as well, along with non-championship wins at Bari and Donington Park. The season continued this way with the Alphas dominating by winning all pole positions and all races. Farina was able to capture the World Championship by a slim 3 points because in addition to his 3 wins, he had a 4th place finish, as opposed to Juan Manuel Fangio's 3 wins and no other points paying position. Farina is best remembered for his style of driving, the relaxed inclined position and outstretched arms that was to influence a whole generation of F1 pilots. In the 50s, at the start of modern Formula 1, the cars were front-engine beasts with large displacement motors and minimal testing and design improvement. Thus, even in post-war days, many of Farina's contemporaries still sat crouched fighting with the wheel. Leaving for Ferrari in 1951, the first world championship for Juan Manuel Fangio driving an Alfa, and the era of Scuderia Ferrari's first official F1 win at Silverstone, the Pampas Bull Jose Froilán González driving. For the next 2 seasons, Farina fought a personal battle with Alberto Ascari, a battle he was bound to lose. Ascari was by far the better driver, more controlled, faster and more precise. Ascari won the F1 World Championship in 1952 and 1953 in the iconic Ferrari 500. It was not an easy beginning. In those twin early years of 52-53, the lack of entrants meant the authorities were forced to conduct most races to Formula 2 regulations. Of the 20 markers that competed in 1950, a large number were soon forced out by cost. Nonetheless, Ascari claimed the distinction of being the first repeat world championship at the end of the 1953 Grand Prix season. Development of the cars was slow because the engine formulas would be changing again for the next year. This meant that F1 cars were basically the same with only slight modification as time allowed. Fangio was able to pull Maserati back up into the winner's circle by year's end, thus preventing Ferrari from having 2 perfect seasons in a row. Indeed, it is Juan Manuel Fangio from Argentina who epitomizes the first decade of Formula 1, winning 5 world championships for 5 different constructors and 4 consecutively from 1954-57. Mercedes and Lancia would debut their cars mid-season 1954, releasing their drivers to run other teams' cars early on. It was this strange practice that allowed Fangio to become world champion while winning for both Maserati and Mercedes in the same season. In 1955, the only race Fangio did not win was the British Grand Prix, which was taken by the man who was to give him an iconic challenge in future years. This was the first time an Englishman had won his home GP, albeit for a German team. However, Fangio won the Drivers' Championship from Moss, Castellotti and Farina. The 1955 season was also the Formula 1 year that will go down in infamy in motor racing. In a single season, the lives of Alberto Ascari and Bill Vukovich, 2-time winner of the Indianapolis 500, were lost and the terrible Le Mans disaster occurred. Automobile racing came to a virtual standstill and much of the F1 season was cancelled. When Mercedes withdrew from racing after that horrific multi-car accident, which Fangio barely escaped, at the 55 Le Mans 24 hours, which left 85 people dead, Fangio moved on to Ferrari, racing Lancias for a year, winning in 1956 with 5 poles, 3 wins and 1 second out of 7 World Championship races. In 1957 season, Fangio recorded his 4th consecutive driver's title, an astonishing achievement which would not be matched for nearly 50 years. Perhaps Fangio's greatest race was the 1957 German GP at the Nürburgring. Driving a Maserati 250F, he lost 56 seconds and the lead in a pit stop but returned to win by letting loose the most spectacular pursuit of his life, bettering the track record for the 14.2-mile North Ring by an amazing 12 seconds on 3 consecutive laps. He broke and rebroke the ring lap record, and when the Ferraris realized the danger, he was already in their mirrors. As the car thundered past the south curve, Fangio closed right up to Peter Collins' gearbox and swept by with one wheel on the grass, peppering the Englishman with stones. It was the Argentina's 24th and final Grand Prix victory, and also his most impressive. His last race was the Grand Prix of France at Reims in July 1958. Fangio's rival, erstwhile teammate and admirer, was Stirling Moss, the greatest F1 driver never to win a championship, who finished second to Fangio at Mercedes in 1955 in the famous covered wheel Silver Arrows with Maserati in 56 and then again with the Van Wall in 57. Moss became the first Briton to win the British Grand Prix at Entry in 1955 and the first to do so in a British car, the 1957 Van Wall VW5. After learning his craft in Fangio's Spillstream, Moss increasingly became the great Argentinian's main rival. After Fangio retired, Moss took over the mantle of the best driver in the world, but his career declined, leading to retirement following accidents during the 1960 Belgium Grand Prix at the Spa-Francorchamps, where Moss was thrown from the car while navigating the intimidating Mazda King, breaking both legs after a rear axle broke at over 130 miles per hour, and an even worse shunt at Goodwood in 1962. The British Era. Despite Stirling Moss's mid-1950s heroics, the British era really began in the 1958 season when Moss won the 1958 Argentine Grand Prix in Rob Walker's privately entered, underpowered but revolutionary rear-engine Cooper T45, a car that gave away almost half a liter to its rivals and for which the race promoters at first refused to pay up, saying the funny little car did not look like a proper Grand Prix machine. The Cooper started a coup d'etat that would soon overthrow the existing scale of values in the small society of Formula One. Taking advantage of rule changes that outlawed aviation petrol, Cooper recognized that reduced fuel consumption and shorter races inevitably gave an advantage to lighter cars with less generous proportions, as the cars did not have to last so long or carry as much fuel. The 1959 season then produced a fabulous contest in which Briton Mike Hawthorne captured the Formula One World Championship driving a Ferrari 246 after the death of fellow Brit Peter Collins in the French GP at Reims, and Moss once again finished second in the Van Wall, designed by Colin Chapman. Disenchanted and distraught by Ferrari politics, Hawthorne, the first British world champion, retired at season end, only to be killed just months later in a road accident in his Jaguar in January 1959. Van Wall withdrew from F1, but in its place were to come a series of dominant British Grand Prix teams, making British racing green the official colour of F1 for more than a decade and ushering in an era of British F1 engineering excellence that extends to today. Between 1962 and 1973, British Formula One teams won 12 World Championships with drivers the likes of Scots Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart, Australian Jack Brabham, Englishman Graham Hill, and New Zealander Danny Hulme. It started in 1959-60 with the Cooper team using a 2500cc Converti Climax engine and a new iteration of astonishingly innovative rear engine design coupled with front-mounted radiator, which captured back-to-back F1 titles for Jack Brabham with a combination of superb weight distribution and handling. Driving a works, Cooper along with Brabham to second place in the 1960 World Championship was young New Zealander Bruce McLaren, whose real fame, like Enzo Ferrari, came later as a team owner. Every F1 world champion since has been sitting in front of his engine. Yet it was Colin Chapman's team Lotus, pushed by his engineering brilliance, that dominated the second decade of Formula One. Chapman's mustache and blue cloth cap, which he threw into the air at trackside whenever Lotus won a race, would become familiar at circuits around the world. He was a constant source of technical innovation, and it is fair to say that Chapman did more than anyone else to change motor racing worldwide. He realized that for racing cars, reliability meant increased weight and lost speed. So there was an advantage in making cars so light they would be at the point of mechanical failure by the end of a race. All too often, this meant that Lotus F1 cars collapsed a few miles too early, but when they did not, they were unsurpassed. Beginning in 1960 with Moss and Innis Ireland, Lotus thrived on the extraordinary relationship between Chapman and his prodigy driver Jim Clark, who was to make the most of Lotus's technical advances for F1 cars. The most important of these was monocoque, or one-piece chassis, introduced with the Lotus 25 in 1962, which along with rear engines marked the second watershed technology change in Formula 1. By reclining the driver's position, Chapman was able to reduce the car's cross-section, hence aerodynamic drag. Shortly later, Chapman would take things a step further, bolting Coventry Climax and then Ford Cosworth engines to the rear of his Lotus's monocoques and hanging the suspension off of them, thus transforming the engine into a stressed member of the car's chassis itself. Those same three features continued as the fundamental basis of Formula 1 car designed to this day. After an initial controversy at Monza in 1961, where he was involved in an accident that claimed the life of Wolfgang "Taffy" von Trips, giving the American Phil Hill and his famous shark-nosed Ferrari 156 dyno, Clark barely lost the 1962 title to Graham Hill, then driving for BRM, British Racing Motors, when an oil leak caused a DNF while leading the final race and the season points at South Africa's Kyalami. In 62, the only interruption to British dominance was Dan Gurney's win for Porsche at Rouen in France. Also of note during the season was the appearance of a small new car at the Nürburgring, which was piloted by its builder and owner Jack Brabham. Clark won handily for Lotus in 1963, winning 7 of 10 GPs and 4 consecutively on the set of Dunlops, and repeated in 1965, posting the maximum possible F1 World Championship points in the both seasons. All this despite taking May off almost every year and missing Monaco to compete in and become the first Briton to win the Indianapolis 500, bringing the rear engine revolution to the winner's circle at the Brickyard. While Clark scored points in just 6 1965 races, all 6 were wins, including a victory spree of 5 consecutive GPs, taking the checkered flag at Spa, Clermont-Ferrand, Silverstone, Zandvoort, and the Nürburgring. A rising star in F1 was Jackie Stewart, rookie driver for BRM, who scored a point in his first ever Formula 1 race and posted a win at Monza in just his 8th Grand Prix start. A small Japanese automaker, Honda, also won the last race of the year with Richie Ginter driving, giving the Asian firm its first ever victory in Formula 1. Nonetheless, a brief 5 years after its maiden F1 victory, Lotus was indisputably the best team in the world. The Lotus string of championship was broken only by 2 drivers. The first was former motorcycle great John Surtees in the 1964 Ferrari 158. It would be 11 years before the Scuderia of Maranello would win another F1 title, the only man ever to be world championship on 2 wheels and 4, and only because Clark suffered engine failure on the second to last lap of the 1964 Mexican Grand Prix, allowing Surtees to slide into second place and beat Graham Hill by a single point for world championship, as only the top 6 results counted. The second was Jack Brabham with his Brabham racing team, which won in 1966-67, while Lotus struggled with horsepower after Formula 1 belatedly moved to an increased 3.0 liter specification, causing Coventry Climax to withdraw from racing at the end of 65, while other British engine suppliers were not ready for the new specifications. Jimmy Clark may have been the most naturally talented driver ever to appear in Formula 1. He won 4 straight Belgian GPs at the tremendously difficult Spa-Francorchamps circuit. a track he despised and was masterful in wet conditions. Clark raced intuitively, saying that when he needed to go faster, he would not drive any faster, rather concentrate harder. His dominant 1965 season in the Lotus 33, in which he led every lap of every race he finished, is matched in F1 history perhaps only by the spectacular 1988 results of alien Prost and Senna at McLaren. But the single fact which tells the most about him is that only once did Clark finish second. In other words, if he made it to the flag, he invariably made it before anyone else, typically running away into the lead and driving uncontested to finish. Clark broke the immortal Fangio's record for career GP victories in the opening round of the 1968 season at Kyalami in January, where the first sponsorship leveraged F1 car was unveiled by Chapman but died a few short months later at Hockenheim in a relatively inconsequential F2 race after veering off into the trees in the wet on 7 April. Small plaque, now located behind a protective Amrock guardrail, is set in the forest to mark the spot of his tragic and still largely unexplained accident. Even more sadly, the Hockenheim ring was reconfigured in 2001 to take away its classic long straights through the forest and then dropped as the home of the German Grand Prix in favor of an equally emasculated Nürburgring, making that small monument itself now a part of F1 history. Whether Clark, a private and soft-spoken man, would have prospered in the modern era of F1 commercialism and downforce will never be known, but his absence ended a time of relative innocence in Formula 1. As Chris Amon, then with Ferrari, said in 1968, if it could happen to him, what chance did the rest of us have? I think we all felt that. It seemed like we'd lost our leader. One of the most significant developments in Formula 1 history occurred before Jim Clark's death in 1967 when Ford partnered with Team Lotus to develop the fabled Cosworth F1 engine. Indeed, if the 60s had a turning point, it was the 1967 Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. While earlier engineering innovations like the monocoque chassis were more important technically, Zandvoort witnessed the debut of the Ford Cosworth DFV 3.0 V8, the power plant that would go on to dominate Formula 1 for nearly 2 decades. At Zandvoort, the new Cosworth engine brought two-time F1 world champion Clark just the second Grand Prix victory since his amazing 1965 season. With minor trouble from wheel bearings hampering the qualifying performance of his Lotus 49, Clark started well back in 8th on the grid behind teammate Graham Hill's pole position, 4.2 seconds faster than the lap record. After 11 laps, Hill was out, handing the lead to Jack Brabham, followed by Jochen Rindt. But just 5 laps later, Clark had passed both, taking a lead which he held to the end, eventually winning by 23.6 seconds. By the end of 1967, the Lotus 49s were so dominant that Hill and Clark would toss a coin to see who should win, with only unreliability denying Clark a third world championship. Although Team Lotus's exclusive use of the DFV ended with 1968's season-opening South African GP, the Cosworth would go on to win more than 150 Grand Prix, the most persistent and successful of any F1 engine ever, and ushered in an era of Formula 1 constructors in which a comparatively level playing field prevailed. For nearly 20 years afterwards, aside from Ferrari and BRM, all race-winning teams used off-the-shelf Ford Cosworth engines. Only the arrival of the Turbo Era eventually displaced it. As we would soon see, although the age of F1 privateers was almost over, by the virtue of Ford Cosworth, the epoch of garagistas, as Enzo Ferrari disparagingly dubbed them, like Ken Tyrrell, overwhelming British, would continue well into the 1970s. Wings and ground effects. The third decade of modern Formula 1, the 1970s, began with the only posthumous F1 world champion and closed with the advent of turbo-powered cars. Points in between saw a heady mixture of close racing, new and old winners, exciting cars and amazing acts of sporting heroism. It was truly a special age, quite different from today, but the roots of the innovation and competition that characterized the 1970s and the early 1980s were in fact laid a few years years earlier with the transformation of aerodynamic design from a relatively simple drag reduction exercise to the complex, defining characteristics of contemporary F1 racing, downforce. Formula One aerodynamic engineering developed at a furious pace, seemingly out of nowhere, beginning with the initial introduction of wings, or aerofoils, midway during the 1968 season. Borrowed from Jim Hall's revolutionary Can-Am Chaparral, wings allowed for the generation of downforce, pinning cars to the track for greater traction and vastly increased cornering speed. Starting precariously, the original high-mounted, manual adjustable rear wings tended to fall off, causing tremendous shunts. F1 aerodynamic engineering proceeded in fits and starts. Jackie Oliver's practice crash in the Lotus 49B at Rouen in July 1968, followed by disastrous accident for Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt during the 1969 Spanish GP at Montjuic, caused wings to be banned for Monaco and the balance of the championship that year. Jackie Stewart's finest victory may have been in the 1968 German GP at the Nürburgring, where in the mist and torrential rain he outpaced the field to win by just over 4 minutes from Hill. After Hill took over as number 1 driver for Lotus to capture the 1968 F1 World Championship, the 1969 season belonged to Stewart and his team owner Ken Tyrrell, who dominated F1 with their Matra MS-80, Germany 68 winning at Chiamali, Zandvoort, Montjuic, Clermont-Ferrand, Silverstone and Monza, although Graham Hill captured his 5th Monaco Grand Prix. Lotus returned in force in the 1970 season, a year which was all about the brilliance of Austrian Jochen Rindt with the new Gold Leaf Lotus 72, first so-called winged car, taking the laurels in Monaco, Holland, France, Britain and Germany. Several of the races were in turn incredibly close. In Monaco, Rindt won in the last 150 meters and in the last 200 meters at Hockenheim, both times stealing wins from Brabham. All that was overshadowed by Rindt's terrible death in practice for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza's infamous Parabolica corner. Seeking more straight-line speed, Rindt had commanded that the Lotus 72's wings be removed, which made the car rather unstable under braking, and the Austrian refused to wear a 3-point harness. Like many drivers of that era, believing being thrown from a crash was preferably to dying in a fire. The result, which to today's observers appears sadly inevitable, was Rindt's decapitation during the car's split-second deceleration after something broke and the nose of his Lotus submarine under the Amco crash barrier. The remaining Lotus cars were withdrawn from the race in accordance with F1 tradition and from the next GP in Canada. At Monza, Stewart was in the act of buckling his helmet when he broke down, wept in a corner, did get into the car, wept again. He could taste the salt of his own tears. Out there as he circled Monza's broad acres, he became a racing driver again. He spent a few laps examining the Parabolica, searching for clues as to what might happen, then drove the fastest lap he had ever driven at Monza. Although the Cosworth engine was by now ubiquitous in F1, the Lotus 72, with its distinctive Sobel nose and nose wings, was significantly faster. Rindt won the 1970 championship posthumously, and his replacement as number 1 driver for Lotus, young Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi, Stewart piloted the 72 first F1 pole position and win in only his 4th F1 start at the season-ending US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. Stewart and Fittipaldi then split the next 4 World Championships, with Stewart taking 1971 and 1973 for the new Team Tyrrell, sponsored by Alf, and Fittipaldi winning with the black John Player's Special Lotus in 1972 and giving Team McLaren its first F1 title in 1974. Bruce McLaren had died after winning 4 GPs, including Belgium in 1968 in his own car during Can-Am testing at Goodwood in 1970. The first of the Stewart title seasons, 1971, was also the year that saw a little-known driver named Niki Lauda start his first race in the Australian Grand Prix and begin began a meteoric climb up the Formula One ladder. Stewart himself retired at Brands Hatch 72 Watkins Glen in 1973, one race short of 100 GPs, withdrawing from the contest after the death in practice of Francois Cavert, his friend and dashing French protege at Tervel. A year before, in 72, Bernie Ecclestone joined the F1 fraternity when he bought the Brabham team, and Jean-Pierre Beltoise posted a memorable last win for the BRM in the rain at Monaco, his only GP victory. Rising once again after the Stewart's retirement, Ferrari returned to the forefront of F1 in 1975 with the flat 12-powered 312T and drivers Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni. Despite a season marred by protests and concerns about driver safety, Fittipaldi refused to drive in the Spanish GP at Barcelona's beautiful Montjuic Park, which was stopped after 29 laps when a car launched into the crowd despite new Armco barriers hurriedly installed at the directive of FIA, killing 4 spectators. Lauda took 9 poles and won 5 races to comfortably secure the first of his 3 F1 crowns. Though there was a total of 9 different winners in 6 different marques, including Vittorio Brambilla for March at Oostenrijk, becoming the only F1 driver ever to take the checkered flag backwards, spinning out of control as he crossed the line, Lauda outclassed the whole field. Ferrari driver hadn't captured the World Championship since 1964, and the Austrian, who displaced Regazzoni as the Scuderia's #1 driver, helped to galvanize the team into fulfilling its potential. Formula One cars now sported huge and rather ugly airboxes behind the cockpits to increase airflow to the engine, leading the way after a short experiment with the famous 6-wheel Tyrrell P34, which was a frontrunner throughout 1976. To the next major technical revolution in F1, ground effects. But another mention of Niki Lauda, one that illustrates the savagery and heroism of F1, is required before ground effects can properly be explored. Coming off his championship, Lauda battled with James Hunt, driving the McLaren M23 Cosworth to win the 6 of the first 9 races of 1976 season. But at the German Grand Prix on 1st August, Lauda crashed his Ferrari at Bergwerk, a 150 mph section of the Nürburgring, in a massive flaming accident that still brings shivers when viewed to this day. Suffering severe facial burns and inhaling toxic fumes from the car's burning bodywork, Lauda was expected to die and receive the last rites in the hospital. Yet, in a rare display of sheer determination, made a near miraculous recovery to return to the cockpit just 6 weeks later of the Italian GP, where he finished 4th. The Nürburgring's famous Nordschleife was retired as the home of the German GP, the jumps and twists deemed too unsafe for modern F1 cars, and moved to Hockenheim the next year, reincarnated only in shortened sanitized form 20 years later as the Luxembourg GP. If not for the roller coaster tragedy of that 76 season, Lauda would almost surely have been just the second Formula One driver, and the first since Fangio himself to win 3 consecutive championships. Fuji was drawn in another dimension, a widespread disbelief that Lauda was actually alive, never mind driving his Ferrari. After 3 laps, Lauda praised himself out of the cockpit, and as he walked away from the mechanics, someone put a comforting arm around his shoulders. But Niki Lauda needed no comfort from another man. He alone would live with his decision. After several victories by Hunt at MO Sport and Watkins Glen, F1 1976 went down to the last race at Fuji in Japan. Leading the World Championship by 3 points, Lauda withdrew from the race after 3 laps of torrential rain, giving the championship to Master James, Britain's last F1 champion for 16 years, who nursed his rain tires until a late race pit stop and finished the race unable to see the track, not knowing where he had placed or whether he had won the title. Lauda recaptured the title with Ferrari in 1977 but quit the team with 2 races to go. Following a calculated 4th place championship, clincher at the US Grand Prix to join Bernie Ecclestone's Parmalat Brabham team and be replaced in the Ferrari by Gilles Villeneuve. Formula One engineers, now referred to as designers, had been steadily working on aerodynamics for more than a decade. The zenith of the art may have been reached in 1978 with the ground effects Lotus 78-79. Ground effects turned the entire car into a large inverted wing Andretti 78 using side skirts and underbody design to literally glue the car to the circuit. Mario Andretti, who took the Lotus to the championship in 1978, explained that ground effects made the race car feel like it's painted to the road. Colin Chapman's careful development of the ground effect car principle had rendered conventional GP machines virtually uncompetitive in a little over 12 months, as Lotus won 9 of the 15 races in the 78th season. Andretti's own championship winning race was marred by the death of teammate Ronnie Peterson at the start of the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, an accident for which then second-year driver Riccardo Patersi was sanctioned but eventually absolved. Yet the other teams would catch up shortly, and 1978 was the last time a Lotus driver would win the World Championship before Colin Chapman's death. Indeed, the big surprise of 1979 was Team Lotus itself, which tried to continue its amazing aerodynamic experimentation but launched a new car with such problems that the team had to return to the old Lotus 79 models. Afterwards, the Lotus Racing organization slowly and poignantly declined into mediocrity and dissolution, except for the brief flashes of success with the young Ayrton Senna and then Nigel Mansell in the mid-1980s. Despite their advances, ground effects had a problem, namely that slight miscalculations in setup would render the ground effect F1 car undrivable and wickedly unstable. The need to keep ground clearances extremely low led to rigidly sprung, rock-hard cars with virtually no ride height tolerance and little if any ability to handle bumps and curbs. Something really terrible, unnatural and unpredictable would happen if the airflow beneath the car was disrupted for one reason or another. To be honest, there was no such thing as cornery technique in the ground effect era. Cornering was a euphemism for rape practiced on the driver. When you came into a corner, you had to hit the accelerator as hard as you possibly could, build up speed as quickly as possible, and when things became unstuck, bite the bullet and give it even more. In a ground effect car, reaching the limit was synonymous with spinning out. As Lauda commented, the wildest imaginable things could happen behind the wheel of a ground effect car. After advancing throughout the grid, by 1981-82, all teams were using ground effects. But in an effort to bring more driver control and skill to F1 ground effects, first the skirts along with 6-wheeled and 4-wheel drive cars in 1981 and then underbody venturi tunnels in 1983 were finally banned from Formula One. Meanwhile, the economics and business of Grand Prix motor racing was also changed rapidly. Bernie Ecclestone rearranged the management of Formula One's commercial rights, turning the sport into a billion-dollar global business. Becoming president of FOCA in 1978, Ecclestone persuaded the teams of their worth and the value of negotiation as a coordinated unit. Until then, circuit owners and race promoters controlled many aspects of the sport. In 1979, FISA, Fédération Internationale des Sports Automobiles, was formed and almost immediately clashed with FOCA over revenues and regulations. Matters deteriorated to the degree FOCA boycotted the 1980 Spanish GP and threatened a breakaway, tactics that were often turned on Ecclestone years later. In return, FISA removed its sanction from Grand Prix races. An uneasy truce came with the 1981 Concord Agreement, an ultra-secret contract governing allocation of the substantial and increasing revenues from F1, which began worldwide television broadcasting and initiated fees for race promoters that now exceed a rumored $25 million per year per GP. The Turbo Era. With the benefit of hindsight, one can now say confidently that ground effects were less important to the long-run development of F1 technology than turbocharging. Although both were introduced initially in 1977 season, both eventually banned. While Lotus was developing the ground effect principle, Renault re-entered Formula 1 with the Turbo RS01 driven by Jean-Pierre Jabouille. The first turbo engine was remarkably quick, although suffering from turbo lag under acceleration, but very unreliable, and it would be a year before the Renault finished a Grand Prix. The 1977 season also saw the introduction of radial tires, first by Michelin, then followed by Goodyear and Pirelli. Turbo development progressed quite slowly. After the Lotus onslaught of 1978, the normally aspirated Ferrari 312 T4, driven by South African Joris Scheckter, captured the F1 title in 1979. Gilles Villeneuve, described as perhaps the most tenacious fighter seen in racing for years, took second place in the World Championship by a narrow 3 points. Renault won the 79 French Grand Prix with Jabouille, while Villeneuve and Rein Arnoux waged a fantastic duel behind, with Villeneuve crossing the line 0.3 seconds ahead. After this race, however, the tide turned and the new Williams car took the lead, winning 5 of the last 7 races, including a stretch of 4 in a row, and the Turbo Renault recorded 6 poles, making this a very diverse season. It was the reliability of the Ferrari that had won the title, but to the F1 fraternity, it was evident that Williams F1 was the team in the ascendant. That happened the very next season. Indeed, the turning point for turbocharging came in 1980, a year in which Alan Jones and the Williams achieved almost complete domination. While Ferrari had a terrible season, the Scuderia introduced their own turbocharged car at Imola, and Renault won an Interlagos, Calami, and the Oostenrijk Ring. Another highlight of 1980 was the power struggle between FISA and FOCA, the latter now chaired by Ecclestone, which came to a head with a boycott of the Spanish GP and was resolved only with the first Concord Agreement in 1981. Although Cosworth-powered teams would win the championship in 1981 and 1982, Grand Prix was increasingly dominated by the turbos from now onwards. The 1981 season also saw the first win for John Bernard's composite carbon fiber McLaren MP4 chassis, a car that bodily pioneered a technology which was to transform the sport and ultimately made it a lot safer, albeit vastly more expensive for constructors. Still, despite the turbo advances, there were 11 teams in 1982 using the Cosworth engine, including Brabham, for several races, for whom Nelson Piquet had won the 1981 championship by 1 point from Carlos Reutemann, with a 5th place at the US Grand Prix, held in the parking lot of Caesar Palace in Las Vegas. And while the turbos continued to improve, with wins in one half of 14 races, the 1982 season was dominated by a rift between Villeneuve and Didier Pironi at Ferrari that would lead to tragedy for both men. After the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola, in which Pironi passed Villeneuve against team orders while the Ferraris were easily running 1-2 under turbo power, Gilles vowed he would never again speak to his teammate. Gilles has gone, and with him the light of genius in Grand Prix racing. In time, of course, another star will emerge, but it will never twinkle with the same intensity again. We are back to normality once more. The impossible cannot happen. He never did, as 2 weeks later Villeneuve, affectionately called the Prince of Destruction by the commentator Enzo Ferrari, was killed while trying to improve his grid position late in qualifying for the Dutch GP at Zolder in a severe accident in which Ferrari cartwheeled across the track, nose in the sand, flinging the driver out of the cockpit. 4 weeks later, Riccardo Pallotti was killed in his Osala at the start of the Canadian GP at Montreal, now named Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. Pironi himself suffered terrible leg injuries in practice for the German GP at Hockenheim 2 months after that, never to race in F1 again. The turbo era really began to flower in 1983 when Piquet won his second world championship by 2 points. This time using a turbocharged BMW plant, McLaren introduced the tag Porsche engine, and Alain Prost piloted the Renault to 3 checkered flags and a runner-up world championship finish finished despite leading for most of the season, from the Belgian GP in May until the final race in South Africa in October, where a turbo problem forced him to retire. Lotus as well brought out a turbo Renault piloted by fourth-year driver Nigel Mansell to his first podium finish at Brands Hatch. After a 13-year break, Spa-Francorchamps returned to Formula 1 in '83. While the circuit was rebuilt and much shorter than the original, it was instantly regarded as one of the best on the F1 calendar. In the 1984 season, with a new MP4/2 car designed by John Bernard, McLaren and the TAG Turbo won 12 of 16 races and took the Constructors' Championship with record points. Niki Lauda secured 5 of those to 7 for Prost, winning the F1 Drivers' title by 1/2 points, the strange total arising because the '84 Monaco GP was halted in a thunderstorm after 31 laps and only half points awarded. That was also the race, by now legendary, in which Ayrton Senna, driving for Toleman in his first F1 season, passed Prost on the last lap in the rain and forever accused the Formula 1 establishment of stealing the win. While many observers felt McLaren's dominance was a one-time fluke, in reality it was a harbinger of things to come. Whether with the TAG or in 1988, Honda Turbos, Ron Dennis's team stamped its mark on the late 1980s like no team before. Prost won the World Championship in 1985 and 1986, the latter after Nigel Mansell, now with Williams, suffered a dramatic rear tire explosion at 180 miles per hour in Adelaide near the tail end of the season's last race, which was a remarkable season. The story of '86 had been the intense rivalry between Mansell and Piquet. Together they would take 9 wins out of 16 races, Mansell edging the Brazilian 5-4. However, while the Williams duo was slogging it out for the team supremacy, Prost was quietly racking up the points too, winning in San Marino, Monaco and Austria. At the 14th round in Portugal, he finished second behind Mansell to move within a point of Piquet in the standings, winning a dramatic Adelaide season ending Australian Grand Prix. In 1987, a Williams year, the British Grand Prix was one of those Formula 1 fairy tales. Gritty drive from a local hero, overcoming the odds to fight back for an unlikely win in front of an adoring home crowd. Nigel Mansell was the man who brought Silverstone quite literally to its feet that season. Nonetheless, Piquet captured the 1987 World Championship after a qualifying accident sidelined Mansell in Japan for the Brazilian's third title. With some irony, Senna pointed to the sky each time he passed the line, reminding officials and anybody else that in Monaco in 1984, when the situation was the other way around, they had stopped the race. He won it the hard way, juggling his fuel consumption, his lead and the weather perfectly. Ayrton Senna, the boy from Brazil, was world champion. Then Senna, who had won his first Grand Prix with a brilliant drive in the rain at the 1985 Portuguese GP, joined McLaren and convincingly won the F1 title in 1988, taking the championship deciding race in Japan at Suzuka. After stalling on the grid with an inspired drive to catch and pass Prost and then draw away in the rain. Each of the Prost and Senna was eventually to win 3 drivers' title with Dennis and Team McLaren. And as a season, 1988 was like no other, with Senna and Prost finishing 1-2, combining for 167 points while winning 15 of the 16 GPs, and McLaren cruising to the Constructors' title, shattering 1984's total. Yet it was also the swan song for both the Turbo Era, as normally aspirated engines were mandated beginning in the 1989 season, and for cooperation between Prost and Senna, as their rivalry would boil over into thinly disguised disdain and dramatic on-track clashes in the coming seasons. But while things would be very different with Team McLaren and in its Bernard-designed cars as F1 moved towards 1990s, their almost complete dominance of the series, judged by many fans as boring to watch, would continue into Formula 1's 5th decade. Technological developments. Talking about the technological developments, first major technological development, Bugatti's reintroduction of mid-engine cars following Ferdinand Porsche's pioneer auto unions of the 1930s occurred with the Type 251, which was unsuccessful. Australian Jack Brabham, world champion during 1959, 1960 and 1966, soon proved that the mid-engine design's superiority. By 1961, all regular competitors had switched to mid-engine cars. The Ferguson P99, a four-wheel drive design, was the last front-engine F1 car to enter a world championship race. It was entered in the 1961 British Grand Prix, the only front-engine car to compete that year. During 1962, Lotus introduced a car with the aluminum sheet monocoque chassis instead of traditional space frame design. This proved to be the greatest technological breakthrough since the introduction of mid-engine cars. During 1968, Team Gunstone became the first team to run cigarette sponsorship on their Brabham cars, which privately entered in orange, brown and gold colors in the 1968 South African Grand Prix on 1st January 1968, thus introducing sponsorship to the sport. 5 months later, Lotus as the first works team when they painted an Imperial Tobacco livery on their cars in the 1968 Spanish Grand Prix. Aerodynamic downforce slowly gained importance in car design with the appearance of aerofoils during the late 1960s. During the late 1970s, Lotus introduced ground effect aerodynamics, previously used on Jim Hall's Chaparral 2J during 1970, that provided enormous downforce and greatly increased cornering speeds. The aerodynamic forces pressing the cars to the track were up to 5 times the car's weight. As a result, extremely stiff springs were needed to maintain a constant ride height, leaving the suspension virtually solid. This meant that the drivers were depending entirely on the tires for any small amount of cushioning of the car and driver from irregularities of the road surface. And that's the wrap for this video. Hope you got more information about F1's history and origin. Please make sure to hit the like button, smash the subscribe button, and also don't forget to ring the bell icon. We will see you on the next one.